Hi guys, and welcome back. Have you ever heard about the butterfly effect? Well, it's a concept that theorizes that a small cause can have much larger effects. So you may be surprised that something as small as a watch has had such an effect as to shape the world as we know it today. So here is my list of watches that I think has helped to influence events or watch design so that we are where we are today. So without further ado, let's begin our countdown. Starting at 10, we have the H4 clock made by John Harrison, a clock that could be argued helped greatly for the British Empire to become the largest empire in the world. At its height, the British Empire held sway to nearly a quarter of the world's population. Whether that's an achievement to be celebrated or not is debatable, but they could not have done it without the invention of the H4 chronometer by John Harrison. The problem was that in the 18th century there was no accurate way of calculating longitude, or to put another way, where you were east to west along the Earth. The problem could be solved if you knew the current time back at home and also at your current position on the sea. The difference in the time could be used to calculate where you were on the planet. Pocket watches during the time were far from accurate, and pendulum-powered clocks did not work on boats due to the rocking motion. So the British government in 1714 set a challenge with a prize equivalent to £2 million in today's terms for anyone that could come up with a solution. John Harrison, a carpenter from Yorkshire, entered the fourth iteration of one of his clocks into the competition. After successfully proving that he could be accurate at sea to within 2.5 seconds a day, the prize was awarded to him in 1765. So this chronometer not only helped the British Navy to sail accurately around the world, it can also be considered to be the ancestor to today's modern watches. At 9, we have the very first wristwatch in the world, the Brigade 2369. There are at least 2 different manufacturers who claim to have made the very first wristwatch in the world. However, the only one with documentary evidence is Brigade, because they can prove from their records that they were commissioned a wristwatch for the Queen of Naples, Caroline Murat, in 1810. Caroline Murat was no less than the sister of Napoleon, so despite that most wristwatches are worn by men today, the first wristwatches were worn by women. Men preferred to carry pocket watches and did not wear a watch on the wrist. However, with the breakout of the Second Boer War and the First World War in the early 20th century, soldiers realized the practicality of wearing watches on their wrist because it meant that their hands were free in battle. They began wearing pocket watches attached to leather straps known as wristlets. Manufacturers realized this and advertised their products towards soldiers. At 8, we have the world's first pilot's watch, the Cartier Santos. It is claimed that the Wright brothers made the world's first flight, but there was also another contender, and this was the wealthy Brazilian called Alberto Santos Dumont. Santos made the first powered plane which could take off under its own power using wheels and was also controllable by the pilot. The Wright brothers' plane, however, was only capable of flying by using a rail or catapult system. The first pilot's watch was born after Santos complained to his watchmaker friend Louis Cartier the difficulty of checking his pocket watch while flying. Cartier came up with a watch that could be worn on the wrist, with a dial large enough for the pilot to see clearly. He named it the Santos after his friend, and today the Cartier Santos is still produced since its first production run in 1911. Thus, in its small way, this watch contributed to the progress of aviation. At number 7, we have the Rolex Oyster. This watch can be considered to be the grandfather of all diving watches. We have learned now that during the early part of the 20th century, and especially after the First World War, the wearing of watches on the wrist, i.e. wristwatches, was becoming more popular amongst men and coming away from the use of pocket watches. This meant that watches were becoming exposed to the elements, whereas they were relatively protected from things such as dust and rain when kept inside the pocket. If moisture or dust could get into the mechanism of a watch, whether from the watch falling into water or even from condensation, it would be disastrous because not only would it affect the accuracy, it would also make the mechanism prone to rust. Now enter Hans Wilsdorf. He was the CEO and founder of Rolex, and in 1926 he came up with a watch that was resistant to both dust and water. He achieved it by giving the case a screw-down back and bezel. You can see that the bezel on this watch is fluted, which is for added grip to achieve a tighter fit. This fluted design can still be seen on modern-day day-date Rolexes. Most importantly though, he gave the watch a screw-down crown to prevent water from getting into the watch via the winding mechanism. He called this watch the Oyster, and all he needed to do now was to publicize it to the world to get the sales coming in. Wilsdorf, though, was nothing if not a brilliant marketing genius. He was living in England around the time, and in 1927 he heard about a lady called Mercedes Gleitz, who became the first English woman to swim the English Channel. It took her just over 15 hours, but no sooner had she completed her feat, a rival swimmer claimed to have swum the distance in 13 hours, and to add insult to injury, also claimed that Mercedes did not finish her swim, so doubt was cast on Mercedes' achievement. Mercedes decided to do another swim, which she called her vindication swim, just 2 weeks after completing her first swim. Hans Wilsdorf, sensing an opportunity to get publicity for his Rolex Oyster, gave Mercedes a watch to wear on her swim, knowing that her swim would be fully reported in the press. Mercedes wore the watch around her neck on the swim, and Wilsdorf was thus able to prove that the Rolex Oyster was waterproof. So this watch goes down in history as being the forerunner to all waterproof watches. At 6, we have the Panerai Radio Mir. We saw that the Rolex Oyster was the first waterproof watch, but the Panerai was the world's first professional dive watch, and as we will find out, Rolex and Panerai have far more in common than you'd imagine. We know of Panerai today as being a luxury brand supplying prestige watches to the rich and famous and celebrities such as Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, but this brand had much more humble beginnings. Panerai watches were initially manufactured as workhorse tool watches designed to perform a function and not for posing. The Panerai company was founded in 1860 by Giovanni Panerai, and their shop was based in Florence, Italy. Panerai started out by supplying instrumentation such as compasses and depth gauges to the Regia Marina Italiana, or the Royal Italian Navy. When asked by the Navy to supply watches as well in 1935, Panerai did not have the ability to develop a diving watch in-house, so they turned to Rolex for assistance, having heard about Rolex's ability to make waterproof watches. So Rolex supplied the cases and the mechanism of all Panerai branded watches supplied to the Italian Navy between 1936 and 1956. The stipulation which Panerai gave to Rolex was that the watches had to be waterproof and large enough to be seen underwater. At 47mm in diameter, these watches were massive, judging by the standards of the day. For example, most men's watches of the time were only around 30mm in diameter. The third stipulation Panerai could handle themselves, and that was the watches should be able to be read at depth, where there was very little light. Panerai held the patent to a material which they had invented and they called Radiomir. This material consisted of a mixture of barium and radium. The radiation given off by the radium caused the barium to glow a beautiful green color. Thus, when this material was applied to the dial's hands and the number markers, they would glow and made the watch readable underwater. The only downside, of course, was that this material was deadly. Incidentally, radium was the material used to poison and kill the Russian whistleblower Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, so you can imagine what it did to the workers that applied the luminous material to the watch dials. Many of them would moisten the brushes they used to apply the lume between their lips, so they were ingesting massive amounts of gamma radiation. However, little was known about the poisonous effects of radiation in the early 1930s. So the Italian Navy was in possession of these Panerai diving watches, and on the 19th of December 1941, during World War II, they were used in a daring operation to blow up 4 moored British ships in Alexandria Harbour, Egypt. 6 members of the Decima Flotilla, which was a specialized diving division of the Italian Navy, wore specialized diving gear as pictured here and used a manned torpedo like this one to attach explosive charges to the ships. They were successfully able to destroy the battleship HMS Elizabeth along with 3 other ships that caught fire, despite one of them being captured after the operation. Luckily, despite the extensive damage to the ships, there was no loss of life on either side. At 5, we have the Swiss Railway Clock. This clock has been in use on the Swiss Railways since being designed by Hans Filke in 1944. It was designed so that it was able to be read from a distance, and the sweeping red coloured second hand is in the shape of a railway guard's signal disc. The Swiss Railway is known to be one of the most efficient railway systems on Earth. This can be qualified by the fact that 90% of the trains make their destinations within 3 minutes of the published time. This is at least partly due to the fact that all the clocks at a Swiss railway station are synchronized by a radio signal so that they all show the same time. The design is so well known that even Apple decided to use it in its iOS 6 operating system, but they allegedly had to pay the Swiss Railway Authority $21 million for the privilege. Today you don't have to pay that much to be able to wear the design on your wrist, because the classic railway clock can be purchased as a wristwatch after Mondane purchased the rights to the design in 1986. At 4 we have the Sturmanskie military issue watch. You're probably asking, what is this unknown Russian watch doing on this list and how did it shape the world? Well, this watch is believed to be the first watch worn in space, worn on the arm of Yuri Gagarin when he went up into space on board the Vostok 1 on the 12th of April 1961. Around this time in the Earth's history, we were at a time of relative peace. With 2 world wars behind us, it was a time to progress and move on with technical achievements and innovation. However, there was a Cold War going on between the East and the West, meaning that there was a relative lack of trust between America and Russia. The 2 countries were also competing against each other with their space programs, and Russia was already ahead as they had launched the first satellite into space in 1957 with the Sputnik 1. So the fact that Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space may have helped to spur the United States with their space program to send the first humans to the moon in 1969. We all know that the Omega Speedmaster was the first watch worn on the moon, and Omega had spent millions of dollars developing and promoting it. However, I love the fact that a whole 8 years before man went to the moon, a human escaped the Earth's gravitational pull and completed an orbit, and the watch which he was using on the mission was nothing more than a Soviet military standard issue watch. Doubts have been cast as to whether this watch could have been sturdy enough to be worn on a space mission. However, I believe that it would have been. By 1961, anti-magnetic and shockproof mechanisms were available in watches. And if we look at the mechanism of the 17 jewel Sturmanskie, which Gagarin would have been issued with, we can see that it has an Incablock shockproof mechanism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think the Sturmanskie was worn on this mission and therefore became the first watch in space, so leave your comments down below. To help you make up your mind, here is a frame of Gagarin wearing a watch on his arm on the day of his flight. What do you think? Do you think that it's a Sturmanskie? At number 3 we have the Girard Perregaux 350. This was one of the first mass-produced quartz watches, and it holds the dubious honour as being the Swiss watch that almost killed the Swiss watch industry. Switzerland had been a neutral country during both world wars, and this allowed it to sell watches to both sides involved in the war. For nearly 100 years, the Swiss watch industry had a practical monopoly on producing quality mechanical watches. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Seiko of Japan and a Swiss business consortium were competing against each other to produce the world's first quartz watch. Quartz crystal were ideal for use in watches as they oscillated at a known frequency when excited by electricity and were non-moving, unlike the traditional balance wheel in mechanical watches. Seiko got to market first and made the world's first quartz watch with the Seiko Astron in 1969. However, the quartz crystal used in this watch oscillated at a frequency of 8,192 Hz, and the electric circuitry, which was not fully integrated, meant that the technology used in this watch did not become standardized. It was only with the introduction of the Girard Perregaux 350 in 1971 that used a quartz crystal oscillating at 32,768 Hz, and an integrated circuit developed by Motorola meant that this technology was more accurate and cheaper to produce than the Seiko Astron, as well as being more accurate and reliable. So the quartz crystal oscillating at 32,768 Hz and the integrated circuit design was adopted as the standard for quartz watches right up until today. The Swiss watch industry did not adapt to the popularity of quartz watches throughout the 1970s and early 1980s and began to decline during this period. Employment in the Swiss watch industry fell to less than a third of what it was at its height, and many Swiss watch houses either became bankrupt or were swallowed up by other companies. The world's production of watches began to swing from Switzerland in the west to Japan in the east. At 2 we have the Hamilton Pulsar P2. This watch arrived on the scene in 1972 and was sold by Pulsar, which was then a division of the Hamilton Watch Company. This was the world's first electronic digital watch and used quartz technology and light-emitting diodes, or LEDs, to display the time instead of a dial. Like most products that are first on the market, it was very expensive at the time, costing $1,500 for the steel or $2,100 with a gold case. Adjusted for inflation, this would be equivalent to the price of a brand new small car today. The watch was power hungry and the LEDs would only light up for 1.5 seconds to show the time when the button was pressed. Even then, the batteries only lasted for about 6 months. LED technology gave way to LCD or liquid crystal technology a few years later. This had the advantage of consuming less power and the time would be displayed constantly. Japanese manufacturer Casio entered the digital watch market in 1974 with the release of the Casiotron watch. Up until that time, they had been known for manufacturing calculators. They produced large quantities of watches, which drove down the price of digital watches. Texas Instruments, an American company, also entered the digital watch market in 1976, and they were producing about 18 million watches a year. They further cut prices to under $10 a watch. Eventually, companies were competing against each other with high volume, high revenue sales, but very low profit margins. Texas Instruments eventually bowed out of the watch market in 1981, and Pulsar was sold to Seiko in 1978. The speed of the digital and quartz revolution was so dramatic that by the early 1980s, quartz watches surpassed mechanical watches in worldwide sales. At number 1, we have the Swatch Watch. I'm not saying that this watch shaped the world the most, but what I am saying is that this is the watch that reversed the downturn and saved the Swiss watch industry. Thanks to this watch, brands such as Omega are still around today. We learned that the Swiss watch industry was in steady decline throughout the 1970s and early 80s due to competition from cheap and accurate digital watches produced in Japan and the Far East, and also to the antiquated business practices of the Swiss watch industry. Even James Bond stopped wearing Swiss watches and wore a Pulsar digital watch in 1973's Live and Let Die. In fact, things were so bad for the Swiss watch industry that the Swiss government indirectly appointed a businessman called Nicholas Hayek to find out the best way to sell off the remainder of Switzerland's watchmaking industry. Hayek was an eccentric but brilliant businessman known for wearing 4 or 5 watches at the same time, turned out to be the Swiss watchmaking industry's savior instead of their henchman. What he proposed to the government was to merge the biggest remaining brands such as Omega, Tissot and Longines into one group that eventually became the Swatch Group. He put his money where his mouth is by buying a 51% stake in the company and headed it. In 1983, the Swatch Group, or SMH as it was then called, released the Swatch Watch. The Swatch Watch was made in Switzerland but using modern manufacturing techniques, and it had an analog dial but a quartz movement. The Swatch Watch became a huge sales success due to the fact that it was affordable, but it was also an emotive product because they produced limited runs of designs, including ones by famous artists at the time, including Keith Haring and Vivienne Westwood. By the end of 1993, Swatch had sold over 100 million watches, and the Swatch company is now the world's biggest manufacturer of watches with an annual turnover of 5 billion Swiss francs. That's it for now, and thanks for watching the video, guys. Do you agree with my list, and do you think that these watches are of importance for world events or even in the watch industry itself? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe if you haven't already done so, and see you next time.